Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 14th of March 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been displayed on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now this particular article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is Officers with 6 months tenure can be named DGP, says the Supreme Court. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Role of Civil Services in a Democracy. Before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Way back in the year 1996, the former DGP, Prakash Singh Badal, had filed a PIL before the Supreme Court. In this particular PIL, he had raised various instances of abuse of power by the police and also alleged that the police force in India is working in a politically partisan manner. In this regard, Prakash Singh Badal had argued for bringing about the major changes to the police structure, wherein he highlighted that the police force in India should enjoy sufficient amount of autonomy. That is to say, the police force should be free from political interference. Similarly, he also argued that the police officers should enjoy the security of tenure. So based upon this particular PIL, the Supreme Court came out with detailed guidelines related to police reforms in the year 2006. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we shall predominantly focus on three aspects. Firstly, we'll understand as to what were the Supreme Court directives on police reforms in the year 2006. Similarly, in the year 2018, the Supreme Court came out with detailed guidelines related to the appointment of DGP. So we'll understand as to what were the Supreme Court guidelines with respect to the appointment of DGP. Now these guidelines issued by the Supreme Court with respect to appointment of DGP had certain concerns. Hence, in order to address these concerns, the Supreme Court has now come out with recent clarification as highlighted by this particular article. Further, an expected UPSC mains question from this particular article could be analyze as to how the recent Supreme Court guidelines on the appointment of DGP seeks to address the present problems of favoritism and nepotism in the process of appointment of the state police chiefs. Let us now start our analysis with the Supreme Court directives on the police reforms. As you all must be aware that there is huge political interference in the functioning of police force across the country, and this has in turn led to the politicization of the police force. Hence, in order to avoid this particular problem, the Supreme Court of India had asked all the state governments to set up the State Security Commission, wherein the role of the State Security Commission would be to lay down the detailed policy guidelines for the functioning of the police force. Apart from that, this particular commission shall also evaluate the performance of the state police forces. The second direction of the Supreme Court was with respect to the appointment of the state police chief, that is the DGP. Now, the Supreme Court of India had observed that the DGP of certain states were appointed on the basis of favoritism and nepotism without any basis for merit, and this has in turn led to the demoralization of the police force. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the Supreme Court had stated that the state governments should have to appoint the DGP on a basis of merit. And apart from that, the Supreme Court had stated that the DGP should enjoy a minimum tenure of 2 years. The next guideline of the Supreme Court was with respect to the separation of investigation wing of the police force from the law and order functions. Now this becomes extremely important because normally in case of India, it is observed that a police personnel who is involved in law and order functions is also involved in the investigative functions. However, if you look at the nature of skills which are required for investigation, they are quite different from the skills required for the law and order functions. And because of the separation of investigation from the law and order functions, you must have observed that the investigation carried out by the police forces continues to remain poor. So the Supreme Court asked for separating the investigation wing from the law and order functions so as to improve the investigation process in India. The next guideline of the Supreme Court was with respect to the Police Establishment Board. The Supreme Court of India observed that there was a politicization among the police forces in the country because the police forces as such did not enjoy the security of tenure, And more importantly, they face political pressure due to frequent transfers. Hence, in order to remove the political interference with respect to the transfer, posting and promotions of the police officers, the Supreme Court had asked all the state governments to set up the Police Establishment Board. Coming now to the next directive, in order to ensure the accountability of the police forces, the Supreme Court had asked all the states to set up the Police Complaints Authority. And as the name suggests, this particular authority would be required to inquire into all the complaints against the police. The next guideline of the Supreme Court was with respect to the setting up of the National Security Commission. The Supreme Court asked the central government to set up the National Security Commission, and this particular commission is required to prepare a panel of names for the selection of the chiefs of the Central Police Organization or the Central Police Armed Forces such as the BSF, Sashastra Seema Bal, CISF, CRPF, etc. So these are some of the important directions of the Supreme Court with respect to the police reforms issued in the year 2006. Now coming to the Supreme Court guidelines on the appointment of DGP which were introduced in July 2018. Now before understanding as to what these guidelines are, let us first understand as to what was the need for the introduction of these guidelines. Now as we have discussed, in the year 2006, the Supreme Court of India had come out with certain guidelines related to the appointment of DGP, wherein the Supreme Court had laid down that the DGP should enjoy a minimum tenure of 2 years. Now this particular provision of the Supreme Court was misused by some of the state governments, wherein some of the state governments used to appoint the DGP on the last date of his retirement. And since such a person is appointed as a DGP, he would invariably get an extension of 2 years. Now this particular practice of the state governments of appointing the DGP on the last date of his retirement was against the spirit of the Supreme Court directives on the police reforms. And this was leading to the favoritism as well as nepotism in the appointment of DGP. Apart from that, some of the state governments had resorted to the appointment of the acting DGP instead of a full-time DGP. And this was also done in order to avoid following the Supreme Court directions. Hence, in order to address these problems, the Supreme Court came out with detailed guidelines with respect to appointment of DGP in July 2018. Now, as per these particular guidelines, all the state governments are required to send the names of the senior police officers to the UPSC. And from the list of names sent by the state governments, the UPSC is required to prepare a panel of 3 names to be considered for the appointment of the DGP. And such a panel has to be prepared on the basis of both merit as well as seniority. Apart from that, since the state governments had resorted to appointment of DGP on the last date of his retirement, the Supreme Court had asked the UPSC to take into account the length of service left of an IPS officer, wherein the Supreme Court asked UPSC that while preparing the panel of 3 names, the UPSC should take into account only those senior police officers who have at least 2 years of service left. And such a panel of 3 names should have to be sent to the state government, and ultimately the appointment of the DGP shall be done by the concerned state government. However, one main problem with respect to the Supreme Court guidelines for the appointment of DGP was that those police officers who had less than 10 years of service left were not considered for the appointment of DGP. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the Supreme Court has now come out with the recent guidelines, wherein it has stated that when the UPSC is preparing a panel of 3 names, it should take into account all the senior police officers who have at least 6 months of service left. So one major change which has come about with respect to recent guidelines is that while recommending names for the appointment of DGP, the UPSC used to take into account only those senior police officers who have at least 2 years of service left. However, according to recent guidelines, the UPSC would be required to take into account all the senior police officers who have at least 6 months of service left. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Now based upon our video analysis, you can try writing answer to this expected UPSC mains question. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears on page number 14. The title of the article is Embassy Office Real Estate Investment Trust IPO looks to raise 4,750 crores. Now, this particular article highlights that a real estate company known as the Embassy Groups is set to launch India's first real estate investment trust. Hence, this particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Economy, under the subsection Investment Models. Further, an expected UPSC mains question from this particular article could be, the setting up of real estate investment trust would provide boost to the funding of the real estate projects and also enable the investors to have a diversified portfolio of investments. Elucidate. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll first understand as to what exactly are the real estate investment trust, how these real estate investment trust work, and how the setting up of these real estate investment trust would benefit the real estate investment sector as well as the investors in India. Let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. Now, all of you must have heard about the mutual fund companies. Now, what essentially the mutual fund companies do here is that they pool in money from the investors, and this particular money they in turn invest in the capital market in the form of shares, bonds as well as debentures. So whatever profits the mutual fund companies are able to gain from such investment, they are in turn returned back to the investors in the form of the dividends. So if one looks at the real estate investment trust, they are similar to the mutual funds except the fact that they do not invest in the capital market. Rather, as the name suggests, they invest in the real estate projects. Now, these real estate projects could be housing apartments, commercial buildings, office buildings, etc. So, a real estate investment trust pulls in money from the investors and such money is in turn invested in the real estate projects. So, the profits earned by the real estate investment trust through the investment in real estate projects are in turn returned back to the investors in the form of dividends. This is how a real estate investment trust actually works. Now, the capital market regulator in India, that is the Securities Exchange Board of India, has come out with detailed guidelines related to the setting up of the real estate investment trust. And as the title of this particular article suggests, a real estate company known as the Embassy Groups is set to launch India's first real estate investment trust. In this regard, let us understand how the real estate investment trust works and how it earns profits. Now, as we have discussed, a real estate investment trust pulls in money from the retail investors, wherein the retail investors have to invest a minimum amount of rupees 2 lakhs. Which means to say, if you want to invest in a real estate investment trust company, then you cannot invest less than 2 lakhs. And from the money which it pulls from the investors, the real estate investment trust in turn invests this particular money in the real estate properties. And according to SEBI guidelines, minimum 80% of the trust money has to be invested in completed as well as rent yielding properties. Whereas the remaining 20% can be invested in development projects, government securities as well as the equities of the real estate companies. And as you can see here, since 80% of the money is invested in completed and rent yielding properties, this becomes a source of profit for the real estate investment trust. Similarly, the balance 20% of the money can be invested in the equities of the real estate companies, and this is expected to give a boost to the funding of real estate projects in India. And the main source of profit for the real estate investment trust, as discussed, is to the rent as well as the capital gains. Now, the capital gains here essentially means appreciation in the value of a real estate project, and this particular appreciation can be considered as a profit for the real estate investment trust. And according to SEBI guidelines, at least 90% of the profits earned by real estate investment trust have to be distributed back among the investors in the form of the dividend. Now, coming to the benefits of the real estate investment trust. Now, so far, the investors in India were typically investing in the capital market in the form of shares as well as bonds. Hence, the launch of the real estate investment trust provides an alternate option to the investors to invest in the real estate projects. And the second benefit of real estate investment trust here is that, according to SEBI guidelines, all the real estate investment trusts have to be compulsorily listed on the stock exchanges, which means that the retail investors who have invested in real estate projects can actually trade their investment in the stock exchanges. And lastly, as we have discussed, the setting up of real estate investment trust is expected to give a boost to the financing of the real estate projects in India. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to the real estate investment trust. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now this particular article appears on page number 13. The title of the article is India Gets First TIR Shipment via Chabahar Port from Afghanistan. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 International Relations under the subsection Important International Forum, its structure and mandate. In the year 2017, India had acceded to the United Nations Transport International Routier Convention, and because of this particular convention, India has been able to get its first shipment via the Chabahar port from Afghanistan. Hence, in this regard, let us understand as to what is the Transport International Routier, how it facilitates the movement of goods between the countries, who administers the Transport International Routier, and more importantly, what advantages this would have for the Indian economy. Let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. Now you all must be aware that when the goods are being transported between two countries, they essentially have to pass through multiple countries. For example, in this particular diagram, let's say if goods are being moved from country A to country D, essentially the goods have to be transported through the country B as well as country C. So when the goods pass through multiple countries, one essential problem which arises here is that at the border of each and every country, the goods require to get custom clearances, and more importantly, the physical verification of the goods can also take place, and this undoubtedly leads to delay as well as escalation of the cost. Hence, in order to reduce the undue delay in the transportation of goods across the countries, we need to provide a mechanism under which the goods can be seamlessly transferred from country A to country D, wherein the custom clearances given in the country A should also be applicable to the other countries, such as in this particular case, the custom clearances given by country A should be applicable to country B, country C as well as country D. So if you look at the Transport International Routier Convention, this particular convention provides for an international transit system which ensures seamless movement of goods within as well as amongst various countries which are parties to this convention. Which means to say, if all these four countries are parties to the convention, then the goods can seamlessly be transferred from country A to country D without the need for the multiple custom clearances. And you need to note here that this particular convention is under the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And as discussed, the Transport International Routier Convention facilitates the movement of goods across the countries by eliminating the need for the physical inspection of goods at the intermediate borders. It avoids the need for multiple custom clearances, and such a seamless movement of goods across the countries leads to a decrease in cost as well as time. Further, you need to note that the TIR convention is actually administered by the International Road Transport Union. Now coming to the advantages of the Transport International Routier Convention for India. Firstly, it is expected that this particular convention would benefit the Indian traders to have fast, easy and hassle-free movement of goods across the countries. Secondly, this particular convention can allow the free movement of goods across the International North-South Transport Corridor. And lastly, under this particular convention, we can use the Chabahar port for the greater trade integration with Afghanistan. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to the Transport International Routier Convention. With this, let us now move to the next article. The next article appears on page number 13. The title of the article is RBI to inject liquidity via forex swaps. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Indian economy. The Indian economy presently is facing liquidity crunch. That is to say, it is facing shortage of the rupee supply. Hence, in order to improve the rupee supply in the Indian economy, the RBI has so far been carrying out the open market operations in order to pump in money into the economy. However, the Reserve Bank of India has now decided to use a new tool known as the foreign exchange buy or sell swap in order to inject the rupee into the economy. Now this is considered to be quite significant because the RBI is using this particular tool for the first time. And so far the RBI was relying on the open market operations in order to inject the rupee into the economy. Hence, in this regard, this particular tool used by the RBI becomes extremely important. Let us understand as to how the foreign exchange buy or sell swap actually works. Now, under this particular mechanism, the Reserve Bank of India would be buying dollars from the banks, and by buying the dollars, the RBI would be injecting rupees into the banking system. However, at a later date, the RBI would be selling the dollars to the banks and in turn sucking out the money or the rupees from the banking system. The Reserve Bank of India would be totally buying approximately around $5 billion from the banks in India, and the tenure of this particular swap period shall be limited to 3 years. That is to say, in the year 2019, the RBI would be buying the dollars from the banks. However, in year 2022, the RBI would be selling back the same dollars to the banks. Hence, it is expected that between the years 2019 to 2022, the money supply or the rupee supply in the economy would increase. The impact of this particular tool would be, firstly, there would be increase in the forex reserves of the RBI, as the RBI would be buying dollars from the banks and all such dollars would become part of the forex reserves. And secondly, as discussed, there would be increase in the money supply in the economy from the years 2019 to 2022. Now, as we have discussed, since this particular tool has been used by the RBI for the first time in order to manage the liquidity in the economy, this tool becomes extremely important with respect to your upcoming prelims. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is India's Grand Strategy on Pakistan. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, International Relations, under the subsection India and its Neighbourhood. Now, you all must be aware that the Indian Air Force recently carried out the non-military and preemptive airstrikes on the terror camps located in Pakistan. In this regard, this particular article here highlights the strategic advantages of the airstrikes for India. Further, it also gives certain recommendations as to how should India deal with Pakistan in future. Let us analyze these aspects of the article one by one. Let us first understand the strategic advantages of the airstrikes for India. Earlier, the Indian government was following the policy of strategic restraint in order to deal with Pakistan. However, the recent airstrikes show that there has been clear departure from this earlier policy. By carrying out these airstrikes, India has shown its willingness to strike at terror camps located in Pakistan. Secondly, immediately after the airstrikes, the Ministry of External Affairs issued a press statement stating that the airstrikes carried out by India were non-military and preemptive, and more importantly, these airstrikes were carried out in self-defense. Hence, by carrying out the airstrikes in Balakot, India has legitimized the non-military, preemptive and self-defense action against Pakistan, and such an action has been supported by almost all the Western powers. Thirdly, this particular article highlights that the airstrikes carried out by the Indian Air Force show a clear shift in the policy of India from a passive defense to active defense. Now, under the passive defense policy, the focus was on stopping the infiltration of the terrorists into Kashmir territory. However, under the active defense policy, India has now started to target the terrorists on the Pakistani soil. So these airstrikes carried out by India shows a clear shift in the policy from passive defense to active defense. Further, the airstrikes carried out by India attracted a lot of international media attention, and this has led to an increased international visibility of Pakistan's support to the various terror organizations. So because of the media scrutiny, Pakistan has come under immense pressure to stop giving support to the terror organizations. And lastly, this article highlights that even Pakistan supporters such as China as well as Saudi Arabia have also come under immense pressure to persuade Pakistan to give up its supports to the terror elements. It is because of these reasons this particular article here highlights that the recent airstrikes carried out by India has led to certain strategic advantages. Let us now look at the recommendations given in this article with respect to how to deal with Pakistan. Now you all must be aware that the Pakistan army plays a powerful role in Pakistan politics, wherein all the major decisions related to conflicts are actually taken by the Pakistan army. Hence, in this regard, this article believes that in order to de-escalate the tensions between India and Pakistan, there is a need to degrade the role of Pakistan army. That is to say, in order to find a long-lasting peace solution to the problem, there is a need to reduce the role of Pakistan army in a Pakistan politics. Hence, accordingly, this article suggests that India has to follow a dual perspective policy, which is basically a combination of carrot and stick, wherein under the policy of carrot, India has to engage with the civilian government as well as the Pakistani people so as to promote the principle of peaceful coexistence. On the other hand, with respect to the stick policy, India has to degrade the role of the Pakistan army in the Pakistan politics, and this can be done by adopting the strong counter-terrorism strategy to deal with the terror emanating from the Pakistan soil. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is A Model Policy for the Women in the Police. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Governance, under the subsection Mechanism and Laws for the Protection and Betterment of Vulnerable Sections. If one looks at the police strength in India, the women account for hardly 7% of the total police strength. Hence, in order to increase the representation of the women in the police forces, some of the states and union territories have decided to provide for minimum 30% reservation to the women. In this regard, this particular article here highlights that merely providing reservation to the women would not be sufficient, and there is a need to have a comprehensive model policy in order to integrate the women into the police forces. And more importantly, such a model policy should be able to challenge the present patriarchal Indian society. So based upon this particular article, an expected UPSC mains question here could be, there's a need to formulate a comprehensive model policy to increase the women's representation in the police force and to provide them a safe and enabling work environment. In this regard, discuss the broad features of such a model policy. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand the broad features of a comprehensive model policy to increase the representation of the women in the police force. Now, as we have discussed, women presently comprises of only 7% of the police forces in India. Hence, in this regard, this article highlights that the model policy should have to focus on the increasing the representation of the women in the police forces. The article further argues that the reservation alone would not lead to the increase in the representation of the women. Hence, in order to increase the representation, all the state police departments have to come up with an action plan to achieve the target of minimum 30% of the women representation in a time-bound manner. And in order to do this, the state police departments have to carry out special recruitment drives in each and every district of the state. And carrying out these recruitment drives in each and every district would ensure the geographical diversity of the representation of the women in the police forces. Further, according to the current data, most of the women are actually working in the lower ranks. Hence, there is a need to increase the representation of the women at the higher ranks. Which means to say, sufficient amount of opportunities for the promotion of the women should have to be provided in the model policy. Secondly, there is a tendency among the police departments in India to sideline the women police forces. For example, the women may be given jobs which are physically less demanding, or they may be relegated to the desk jobs. Further, the women may be made to work on only the crimes against the women. Now, this clearly shows that there is a gender stereotyping with respect to the deployment of women police forces. Hence, in this regard, the model policy should encourage the women police officers to take up the work of the male police officers as well. And more importantly, the desk job should be equally allocated between the male and female police forces. Further, in case of India, A major burden of family and childcare responsibilities fall on the women. Hence, the state police departments has to take into account this particular social reality and ensure that the women police forces are posted in their own home districts. And secondly, the women police officers should not be frequently transferred. Lastly, sexual harassment at the workplace can actually act as a major hindrance for the women for taking up the jobs in the police forces. Hence, in this regard, all the state police departments have to adopt the zero tolerance policy towards the sexual harassment. Further, in pursuance of Prevention of Sexual Harassment of the Women at the Workplaces Act, all the state police departments have to compulsorily set up the Internal Complaints Committee to handle all the complaints related to the sexual harassment. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Based upon our video analysis, you can try writing answer to this expected UPSC mains question. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is West Nile Fever Case in Malappuram. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection General Science. Now this particular article here highlights that a 7-year-old boy from the Malappuram district of Kerala has been diagnosed with the West Nile fever. Hence, with respect to upcoming prelims, let us understand certain basic details related to the West Nile fever. The West Nile fever is essentially an infection which is caused by a virus, and this particular infection mainly spreads through the mosquito bites, and this can cause neurological disease as well as death in some of the patients. Now this particular infection derives its name from the West Nile district of Uganda, where it was first identified in the year 1937. And this particular viral disease is commonly found in Africa, Middle East, North America as well as Europe. However, the outbreak of this particular disease is quite rare in case of India. Now coming to how the virus gets transmitted, as we have discussed, the virus gets transmitted through the mosquito bites, wherein these mosquitoes feed on the infected birds which are considered to be the carriers of the virus. So this particular West Nile fever disease actually spreads through the mosquito bites. And according to WHO, so far no human-to-human transmission through contact has been observed. Now coming to symptoms of this particular disease. Now the symptoms of this particular infection can vary from patient to patient, wherein in some cases it can be asymptomatic, which means to say a patient may not show any kind of symptoms, or a patient may display the West Nile fever, or in some cases a patient may develop the West Nile disease, which is considered to be a severe neurological disease. And with respect to the treatment for the West Nile fever, the patient needs to be hospitalized and put on the respiratory support. And you need to note here that presently there is no vaccine for the treatment of the West Nile fever disease. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to the West Nile fever. With this, let us now move to the next article. Now these two articles appear on page number 7 as well as page number 18. Now these two articles are related to the Global Environment Outlook report, which was recently published by UN Environment. Now these articles shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 3 under the subsection Environmental Conservation. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand certain basic details related to the Global Environment Outlook report published by the UN Environment. Now as discussed, the Global Environment Outlook report is published by the UN Environment, and this particular report was published for the first time in the year 1997, and presently the UN Environment has released the 6th edition of this particular report, and this particular edition is mainly covering the 6 regions which include Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America and Caribbean, North America and West Asia. Now coming to its assessment about the global environment, now this particular report has highlighted that the poor environmental conditions have led to 25% of the outbreak of diseases and premature deaths across the world. Apart from that, the report also highlights that approximately around 1.4 billion people have died across the world due to lack of access to safe drinking water. Further, the growing air pollution across the world has led to the death of approximately around 6 to 7 million people every year. Now with respect to its assessment rated to India, as you all must be aware, as part of the intended nationally determined contribution, India has given a commitment to reduce its emission intensity of the GDP by 33 to 35% compared to 2005 levels by 2030. Further, India has also committed to increase the share of the renewable energy in the generation of electricity to 40% by 2030. India is also aiming to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons through afforestation. Now, this particular report here has highlighted that India is on track to achieve the first two targets of the INDC. Now, these efforts of the Indian government are consistent with the global efforts to keep the increase in the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. However, this article has highlighted that in order to keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, Indian government would be required to give up the construction of new coal-fired thermal power plants. Further, this particular report has also highlighted that if the global community is able to keep the global rise in the temperature, in that particular case, India could be able to save approximately around $3 trillion, which would otherwise be spent on the healthcare cost. Hence, this particular report has clearly highlighted that by keeping the global rise in the temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, India would be able to save a substantial amount of money on the healthcare cost. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to the Global Environment Outlook report. Now, based upon our video analysis, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We will be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. Now, the first question here is, consider the following statements related to the Real Estate Investment Trust. The first statement here is, the Real Estate Investment Trust pool money from the retail investors for investing money in the real estate projects. As we have discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, the Real Estate Investment Trust are regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. Now, this particular statement here is wrong. This is because the Real Estate Investment Trust are regulated by SEBI. Now, the third statement reads as, all the Real Estate Investment Trusts have to be listed on the stock exchanges. And as we have discussed, according to SEBI guidelines, all the real estate investment trusts have to be compulsorily listed on the stock exchanges. Hence, this particular statement here is correct. So, if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is C. That is 193 only. Now, coming to the second question, the question here is, consider the following statements related to the open market operations. Now, open market operations is essentially a tool used by the RBI in order to control the total amount of money supply in the economy. Through the open market operations, the RBI either sells or purchases the government securities from the banks. For example, by selling the government securities to the banks, the RBI would be able to suck out the money from the banking system. Similarly, by purchasing the government securities from the banks, the RBI would be able to inject the money into the banks. So in order to suck out the money, RBI sells the government securities, and in order to inject the money, RBI purchases the government securities. So if you look at the first statement here, it involves buying or selling of government securities in order to control the money supply in the economy. And as we have discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, the RBI sells the government securities in order to inject the money into the economy. So this particular statement here is wrong, because by selling the government securities, the RBI sucks out the money and not injects the money. So if you look at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is 1 only. Now coming to the third question, the question here is, consider the following statements related to the foreign exchange buy or sell swap. The first statement here is, it is a new tool used by the RBI to control the liquidity in the economy. As we have discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, it leads to decrease in the forex reserves. Now this statement here is wrong. This is because through the foreign exchange buy or sell swap, the forex reserves held by the RBI increases. The third statement reads as, it leads to decrease in the money supply or the rupee supply in the economy. So this statement here is wrong. This is because by carrying out the foreign exchange buy or sell swap, the rupee supply in the economy increases. So if you look at the options here, the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is 1 only. Now coming to the fourth question, the question here is consider the following statements related to the Supreme Court guidelines on the appointment of DGP of the state. The first statement here is the DGP is to be appointed by UPSC. This statement here is wrong. This is because the DGP of the state is to be appointed by the state government. However, the role of the UPSC is to prepare a panel of 3 names to be considered by the concerned state government. The second statement reads as the DGP must enjoy a minimum tenure of 2 years. As we have discussed, this statement here is correct. The third statement reads as in order to avoid favoritism, the DGP must be appointed solely based upon seniority. This statement here is wrong. This is because for the appointment of DGP, apart from seniority, the UPSC is also required to take into consideration merit as well. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.